The UAP Herald, Case File 021, Decreasing Emphasis. In the winter of 1952, the United States government was, by any honest measure, afraid of the sky. That summer, unidentified objects had flown over Washington, D.C., over the Capitol, over the White House, twice on consecutive weekends, tracked on radar, chased by fighters. The newspapers ran it 8 columns wide. The Air Force held the largest press conference since the Second World War. For a few weeks, the most powerful country on Earth genuinely did not know what was in its own air. Now jump forward 1 year. Same government, same subject. And I want to read you the size of the operation that by then was responsible for the entire United States Air Force investigation into flying saucers. It is written down in a classified memo in the government's own flat hand.
The project is carried by 1 officer, 1 airman, and a secretary.
1 officer, 1 airman, a secretary. That is it. That is the whole national UFO project. 1 year after the panic over Washington. 3 people, one of them part-time on the typing. And it gets stranger, because the same memo, written by a man inside the Central Intelligence Agency, notes, with what almost reads like satisfaction, that the number of sightings being reported had gone down. And then it says why. Not because the objects went away, because of a policy, a deliberate decision taken 11 months earlier to strip the whole subject of its, quote, aura of mystery and to quietly talk the public out of looking up. Tonight, the real declassified file, a Central Intelligence Agency memorandum, dated the 17th of December, 1953, held for 72 years, and then handed back to the public in 2026. It is signed. It has an author with a name and a division and a job, and it is not a report about a sighting. There are no lights in it, no craft, no witnesses. It is something rarer, and in its own cold way, more revealing than any sighting report could ever be. It is the paper trail of a government deciding to look away, and writing down that it was working. We are going to read it, line by line, in its own words, and because this is a Herald file, we are going to be honest about the thing it is not. It is not proof of a cover-up of aliens. This memo takes no position on what UFOs are, none. What it is the documented moment an intelligence agency measured its own success by counting how many fewer people were looking at the sky. Let's follow the paper. First, the object itself, the piece of paper. Before you weigh what a document says, you weigh what it is. And unlike a lot of what we read on this channel, this one is not a raw, unevaluated field report from a frightened stranger. This is the opposite. This is an internal memo, written by a professional intelligence officer to his own boss inside the building. It was never meant for you. The header is bureaucratic to the point of comedy, and every line of it matters. Across the top, a date.
17 December 1953.
Then the routing, the way these things always run. To from subject.
Memorandum 2, Assistant Director, Scientific Intelligence. From Chief, Physics and Electronics Division, SI. Subject, Current Status of Unidentified Flying Objects Project.
Read what that tells you. This is not a field agent. This is a division chief inside the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, the OSI, the shop whose entire job was to understand the physics and the technology of what the rest of the world was building. Rockets, radar, nuclear weapons, and apparently flying saucers. This is the science desk, writing up its books, and the reason it is writing at all is spelled out in the very first line, and it is almost aggressively mundane.
In accordance with the verbal request of Mr. Brent, Executive SI, on 30th of November, The following resume of the current status of unidentified flying objects activities has been prepared.
Somebody upstairs, a man named Brent, asked out loud on the 30th of November, "Hey, where are we on the saucer thing?" And this memo is the answer, a status update, the kind of thing that gets written 1,000,000 times a day in every large organization on Earth. Except the subject line, in this one, is flying saucers. There is one more marking that matters, and it is the whole tension of the night in a single word. This unglamorous little status memo, this internal housekeeping note, was classified, stamped across the top and bottom of every page.
Secret.
Hold on to that, because we are going to keep coming back to it. The government's public position by the end of 1953 was that flying saucers were essentially nonsense. Misidentified planes and planets and weather balloons, nothing to worry about, please go home. And yet the memo that says, internally, here is exactly how little we are doing about them. That memo was a secret. You do not stamp secret on a subject you truly believe is nothing. You stamp secret on a subject you have decided the public should stop thinking about. Those are not the same thing. And the only reason you and I are reading it now is a line of fresh modern ink over that 70-year-old typescript.
Approved for release 2026.
The current UFO records law, prying open the vaults, the same statute behind file after file we have read on this channel. So, a real signed, classified CIA memo on the status of the American Saucer Project, released by the government that wrote it. Now let's read what it actually says. Paragraph 2. And it establishes immediately the single most important fact about the CIA's relationship to this whole business, a fact that cuts directly against the popular myth. The myth is that the CIA was running the UFO cover-up, hoarding the wreckage, chasing the saucers. What the memo actually says is almost the reverse.
Physics and Electronics Division assumed responsibility for the OSI project on unidentified flying objects as a result of your memorandum of 27 May 1953. The project has been confined to maintaining awareness of the activities of other agencies, notably the U.S. Air Force, in the unidentified flying objects business, and to maintenance of files.
Confined to maintaining awareness and maintenance of files. Read that slowly, because it is doing a lot of quiet work. The CIA's own science division is telling its boss in writing that its entire UFO job amounts to two things: watch what the Air Force is doing and keep the folder tidy. That is it. That is not an investigation. That is a man keeping a scrapbook. And here is a piece of context the record hands us from outside the document, because this line did not come out of nowhere. The CIA's own official history of its UFO involvement, written decades later by a historian named Gerald Haynes, describes the very man who signed this memo. Listen to how the agency itself describes its own officer.
Todos Odarenko, chief of the Physics and Electronics Division, did not want to take on the problem, contending that it would require too much of his division's time. A non-believer in UFOs, Odarenko sought to have his division relieved of the responsibility for monitoring UFO reports. Given the findings of the Robertson panel, he proposed to consider the project inactive.
So the man writing this status report is not a believer trying to blow the whistle. He is a skeptic trying to put the file down. He thinks the whole thing is a waste of his division's clock, and he has already, months earlier, tried to have it declared inactive and taken off his desk. That is who is holding the pen. Keep that in mind for everything that follows, because it changes the meaning of every sentence. When a believer tells you the government is winding down the UFO effort, you can discount it. When the skeptic who wants it gone tells you proudly in a secret memo to his own boss exactly how far it has already been wound down. That is testimony against interest. That is the strongest kind of evidence there is. And then he turns to the Air Force and gives us the phrase that titles this whole file.
The Air Force continues to maintain, but with apparently decreasing emphasis, its interest in UFOBs.
Decreasing emphasis. That is the temperature of the entire American government on flying saucers 1 year after they flew over the Capitol. Not alarm, not a task force. Decreasing emphasis. The interest is cooling, on purpose, and the memo is measuring the temperature drop like a nurse with a chart. So how little was actually being done? The memo gets specific, and this is where the numbers land like a slap. Because whatever you imagine Project Blue Book was, and Blue Book is the famous one, the Air Force's public UFO investigation, the one they made a television show about, whatever you picture, the reality in December of 1953 was this.
The present interest of the Directorate of Intelligence, Headquarters U.S. Air Force, is confined to a cursory cognizance of ATIC's project, Blue Book number 10073. At ATIC, the project is carried by one officer, Captain Charles A. Hardin, one airman, Airman First Class Max G. Futch, and a secretary.
One officer, one airman, one secretary for the entire United States Air Force investigation into unidentified flying objects. A captain, an enlisted man, and a typist in a room at the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson. That is the machine. That is what was left a year after Washington. And notice the tone. There is not a flicker of alarm about how thin that is. The memo mentions it the way you would mention the office supply order.
In spite of this limited staff, as well as several changes of project officer, the project records appear to be up to date.
The records appear to be up to date. That is the standard. Not, are we solving these? Not, do we know what they are? Just, is the paperwork current? And it is. Good. Well done. And what does that skeleton crew actually do all day? The memo tells you, and this is the part that quietly closes the door on the whole enterprise. They had stopped going out to look.
ATIC personnel no longer conduct field investigations of UFOB sightings. They confine their activities to receiving and checking reports as received, performing necessary checking against meteorological, astronomical, aircraft, and balloon data, and recording their findings and conclusions in a cross-reference system.
They no longer conduct field investigations. Sit with that. The one government project charged with figuring out what was flying over America had by 1953 stopped sending anyone to the scene. A report comes in, a light, a disc, a thing over a runway, and nobody drives out. Nobody interviews the witness on the ground while it is fresh. Instead, 3 people at a desk cross-check the report against a list of the boring things it might have been. A planet, a plane, a weather balloon, write down their best guess, and file it. That is not investigation. That is triage. That is a system built to close cases, not to open them. And there is one number in the middle of all that filing that the memo drops without a trace of curiosity, and that to me is the most haunting figure in the whole document.
For about the past year, approximately 10% of the reported sightings have been tagged as unsolved.
10%. Unsolved. Even with a system designed to explain things away, even with 3 people cross-checking against every mundane cause they could think of, 1 in 10 reports could not be made to fit any of them. And the memo does not linger on that. It does not say we should look harder at that 10%. It just records it like a rounding error and moves on to the next administrative item. 1 in 10, unexplained, and the takeaway in the room was, the records appear to be up to date. Now, The memo turns to a piece of pure bureaucratic housekeeping that turns out to be the most revealing exchange in the entire file, because Blue Book was, at that moment, being moved, handed from the Air Technical Intelligence Center over to a different Air Force command, and the reason given for the move and the way one officer talks about it tells you everything about the double game the Air Force was playing with its own left hand and its right.
Of particular interest is the fact that ATIC is in the process of transferring Project Blue Book to Headquarters, Air Defense Command.
Air Defense Command. Remember what that is. ADC is not a filing office. Air Defense Command is the outfit whose literal job is to shoot down things that threaten American airspace, and a lieutenant colonel named Harry Johnston, the chief of the electronics branch, explains why the Saucer project is being moved over to the people with the interceptors. Read his reasoning in the memo's account and watch the two halves of the sentence fight each other.
If it turns out that these things, UFOBs, are spaceships or long-range aircraft from another country, Air Defense Command is the command that would have to take action.
Stop. Read that again. If it turns out these things are spaceships. Those are the words of a serving Air Force officer in a classified document in 1953, casually laying out the operational logic for who shoots first if the sources turn out to be real, not dismissing the possibility, planning for it, moving the file to the trigger pullers just in case. And then, and this is the tell, this is the whole psychology of the era in one clause, the memo notes that Johnston immediately took it back.
Colonel Johnston followed this comment with the somewhat contradictory statement that the project transfer did not reflect any change in Air Force policy.
Somewhat contradictory. That is the memo's own dry word for it, and it is perfect. In one breath, an officer says, "We are handing the sources to the men with the missiles, in case they are spaceships." In the next breath, the same officer says, "But nothing has changed. This means nothing. Move along." And the memo writer, Odarenko, the skeptic, just notes the contradiction and lets it sit there, naked, on the page. He does not resolve it. He does not have to. That contradiction is the Air Force's entire public posture in miniature. Internally, plan for spaceships. Externally, insist there is nothing to see. Both at once. Both in the same sentence, from the same colonel, on the same afternoon. Now the memo gets to the part that I find genuinely poignant, because it is the story of the government trying, briefly, to actually catch one, and failing in the most human, most ordinary way imaginable. If you are going to solve UFOs, you need data better than a scared farmer's memory. You need instruments. You need to photograph the thing. And about 18 months before this memo, somebody had tried to build exactly that. Listen.
Approximately a year and 1/2 ago, ATIC initiated a program to purchase cameras for selected Air Defense Command radar sites and control towers. 100 Videon 35mm cameras with Stereon anastigmat lenses were purchased, along with 100 diffraction gratings from CENCO, Chicago.
Now this is actually a clever idea, and it is worth understanding why, because it shows somebody in there was thinking like a real scientist. A diffraction grating is a little ruled screen, 15,000 fine lines, that you put over a camera lens, and it splits incoming light into its spectrum like a prism. If you photograph a UFO through one, you do not just get a blurry dot. You get the fingerprint of the light itself, and from that, in principle, you could tell whether you were looking at burning metal or reflected sunlight or a plasma or a planet. It is a genuinely smart plan. Put 100 of these at the radar sites, wait for a saucer, and photograph its soul. And here is what happened to that plan.
90% of the gratings have gone bad. The actual grating separating from the plastic mounting plates. ATIC expects to recall all of the 74 distributed cameras and re-equip them with new gratings.
90%. The glue failed. That is the whole story. The single most scientifically serious thing the United States government tried to do to actually measure a UFO. And the little screens fell off their mounts. 90 out of 100, unstuck, useless. 74 cameras already sent out into the field, now having to be recalled. The eyes they built to see the thing clearly went blind because of cheap plastic and bad adhesive. There is something almost unbearably human in that. We picture government secrecy as this sleek, competent, sinister machine. And then you read the actual file, and the truth is that the one real attempt to get hard data on the phenomenon died because the parts were shoddy and fell apart in a drawer. And it did not stop there. The one place they had planned to really concentrate the effort to blanket a single region with instruments and weight was quietly killed.
Several months ago, we were advised that ATIC planned to set up a concentrated instrumentation observational effort in the Albuquerque area. This has now been dropped.
Dropped. No reason given. The most promising site. The one place with the density of sightings to make it worth wiring up. Cancelled in a subordinate clause, and the memo moves on. So here is the state of America's ability to actually see a UFO clearly in December 1953 as recorded by its own intelligence service. The cameras were broken. The concentrated effort was cancelled, and the field investigations had stopped. They had systematically put out their own eyes. And the one serious analytical product still in motion was a statistics project, handed to an outside think tank, codenamed Project Stork.
Project Stork has been preparing, at ATIC request, a comprehensive statistical report on UFOB sightings during the period 1947 through 1952. This study is now expected to be completed by 1st December 1953.
And here is a thread we have pulled on this channel before. Project Stork was the code name for a study run by the Battelle Memorial Institute, and that study would eventually be published as Project Blue Book Special Report Number 14. We made a whole episode about it. It is the single largest statistical analysis of UFO sightings the US government ever produced, and when it finally landed, it found that the better the sighting, the harder it was to explain. The credible witnesses, the close observations, the trained observers, those were the cases that would not go away. That is the report being quietly cooked in the background of this memo. The government's own numbers, about to say the quiet part. And the reaction, as we will see, was not to look harder, it was to look away faster, which brings us to page 3, and the paragraph that is the reason this dry little status memo actually matters. Because so far, it has all been logistics, staffing, cameras, transfers. Now Odarenko tells you why the whole apparatus is winding down, and in doing so he writes down in a secret document one of the most quietly damning sentences in the history of the American UFO story. It starts with a panel. 11 months earlier, in January of 1953, a group of consultants had been convened to look at the UFO problem. The memo describes what they recommended.
The consultants who considered this problem in January 1953 recommended that UFOBs be stripped of special status and or of mystery, and that policies on intelligence, training, and public education pertinent to true indications of hostile intent or action be prepared.
Now the memo does not name that panel, but we can. And we are telling you plainly that this is our identification from the date and the wording, not something the document says. The consultants convened in January 1953 to strip UFOs of their aura of mystery was the Robertson panel, a CIA-convened group of scientists we devoted an entire earlier episode to, and its actual report, which we have read, recommended, and I am quoting the panel now, not this memo,
that the national security agencies take immediate steps to strip the unidentified flying objects of the special status they have been given and the aura of mystery they have unfortunately acquired, and institute policies on intelligence, training, and public education.
Word for word, special status, aura of mystery, public education. This memo is quoting the Robertson panel's marching orders back to the CIA's own boss, 11 months on, as the governing policy. The debunking program, the deliberate campaign to make the public stop taking sources seriously, was now simply the framework everyone worked inside. And then Odarenko does the thing. He measures whether it is working, and he writes down the result.
The definite drop in the number of sightings reported during 1953 over 1952 could be attributed to actions following these recommendations.
Read that one more time, because it is doing something extraordinary, and it is easy to skate right over. He is saying fewer people reported UFOs this year, and the reason fewer people reported them is the policy. The debunking worked. Understand what that does and does not mean. It does not mean fewer objects were in the sky. It means fewer people picked up the phone. And the memo files that a population trained to stop reporting what it sees on the success side of the ledger as an achievement. The metric of the program was never how many mysteries did we solve. The metric was how quiet did the public get. And by that metric, in 1953, it was going great. There is a coda to this, and it is bleakly funny, and it is the closest the skeptic ever comes to showing his hand. He notes that popular saucer books, the ones claiming UFOs are extraterrestrial, were exploiting official Air Force releases, and of one of the most famous, the George Adamski book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, he writes,
So nonsensical and obviously fraudulent that it may actually help calm down public reaction.
Let that sink in. A CIA officer assessing a book he considers a fraud and concluding that its very ridiculousness is useful because it makes the whole subject look silly, and a public that thinks the subject is silly is a public that stops asking. In the debunking calculus, even the con men were on the government's side. A fraud that discredits the topic does the policy's work for free. Before we do the honest skeptical accounting, there is one more section, and it is the one that quietly widens the whole story out beyond America, because Odarenko dutiful also logs what the other governments were doing. And it turns out the United States was not the only one keeping a nervous, half-embarrassed file. Start with Canada, because it is the strangest entry. The memo notes that the American press had just picked up a story.
Considerable attention in the U.S. press was recently given to reports that the Canadian Defense Research Board and Department of Transport had jointly and officially established a laboratory for recording observable phenomena connected with UFOBs.
An official government saucer laboratory in Canada. And the memo, citing the UFO author Donald Kehoe, adds that a man at the Canadian Department of Transport, named in the file as Wilbur B. Smith, had been running saucer investigations for years. That part is real, and we can confirm it, though we will give you the correct name. The man was Wilbert Brockhouse Smith, a senior radio engineer, and his effort was called Project Magnet, a genuine, officially sanctioned Canadian government UFO study set up in December of 1950, so that thread checks out. But then the same passage carries a rumor we have to flag, because it did not pan out the way the file implies. The memo passes along a claim that
experiments on a flying saucer are actually being conducted at AV Row Limited, Toronto.
AV Row, Avro, Canada. And here is the honest handling. It is true that Avro Canada would, later in the 1950s, actually build a disc-shaped aircraft, a real flying saucer for the American military, the Avro car. That is documented, and it is fascinating, and it barely got off the ground. But that program came after this memo. The claim in this 1953 file is an unconfirmed press rumor, and we are labeling it as one. The reality it seems to predict was still a couple of years away. As for the rest of the world, the memo's account of Britain is one deflating little line.
The only British activity is the filing of reports as received by the RAF.
Just filing them. And Sweden gets the most eloquent entry of all, a passage that has been blacked out, redacted, a solid bar of censorship even now in 2026, followed by the 4 saddest words in any intelligence file.
No further information is available.
Something about Sweden was withheld 72 years later, and then no further information is available. Even in a memo about winding the whole thing down, the censor still found something on the Sweden line worth hiding from you tonight. We do not know what. That is the file being honest about its own silence. So let's do the deflation properly, because this is a case where the skeptical reading is not just strong. It is, on the surface, almost the whole story. Let me put the calmest possible version to you.
There is no mystery here at all. Look at what this document actually is. A mid-level bureaucrat who thinks the subject is nonsense, writing a routine status memo to justify spending as little of his budget on it as possible. Everything you are calling sinister is just ordinary institutional decay. The staff is small because the subject was fading and the money went elsewhere. That is not a cover-up. That is a spreadsheet. The cameras failed because government procurement is bad and glue is cheap. That is not suppression, that is incompetence, and incompetence is the most common thing in any large organization. The field investigations stopped because they almost never found anything worth the gas money. The 10% unsolved is not 10% alien. It is 10% of reports with too little information to bother closing. A light seen for 2 seconds by one person with no follow-up. And the drop in sightings, people got bored. The novelty wore off. The debunking, if it did anything, just accelerated a decline that was coming anyway. Read the whole thing without a conspiracy in your head, and it is exactly what it looks like. An agency correctly concluding it had better things to do.
And most of that is right. I want to be completely honest with you. If you made me bet, I would say the small staff really was just budgets. The cameras really were just bad glue, and the 10% unsolved is mostly thin reports, not spacecraft. The skeptic is not the enemy of this file. On the mechanics, the how and the why of the winding down, the skeptic is basically correct. But there are 2 things the calm reading cannot quite dissolve, and honesty cuts both ways. So here they are, and they are not about aliens. The first is the classification. Strip everything else away, and you are still left with this: a government that publicly said flying saucers were nothing, stamped the word secret on the internal memo, proving how little it was doing about them. Think about that gap. If the subject were genuinely nothing, if it were just planes and planets and bored citizens, there is nothing to classify. You do not lock a filing cabinet on a non-problem. The secrecy is not evidence of a saucer in a hangar. It is evidence of something subtler and, in a way, more troubling, that the government's confidence in public was not matched by its confidence in private. You do not hide the fact that you have stopped looking, unless you think the fact that you stopped looking is itself something the public should not know. And the second is the metric. The thing this memo counts as a win is the silence of its own citizens. Read it cold, and it is chilling in a way that has nothing to do with extraterrestrials, an intelligence agency recording, with approval. that a deliberate policy had succeeded in getting the public to stop reporting what it saw in the sky. Not to stop seeing it, to stop reporting it. That is a real thing. A real government really did, and wrote down, and classified. And whatever was in that 10%, the part they could not explain even with a machine built to explain things away, there was now, by policy, a smaller and smaller chance that anyone would ever call it in again. The objects are not the unsettling part of this file. The decision to stop listening is. Let's lay the timeline down flat so you can see the whole shape of it without the narration.
Summer 1952. Waves of UFO reports peak. Objects are tracked over Washington, D.C. on consecutive weekends. The Air Force holds its largest press conference since the war. January 14th to 18th, 1953, the CIA convenes the Robertson panel, which recommends stripping UFOs of their special status and aura of mystery and launching a public education, that is, debunking, program. 27th May, 1953. Responsibility for keeping abreast of UFOs is handed to OSI's Physics and Electronics Division under Todos Odarenko, a self-described non-believer who does not want it. 1st December, 1953, the Battelle statistical study, Project Stork, is due. The analysis that will become Blue Book Special Report 14. 17th December, 1953. Odarenko writes this status memo: 1 officer, 1 airman, a secretary. The camera's broken. Field investigation stopped. Blue Book moving to Air Defense Command. The drop in sightings logged as a policy success. January 1969. The Condon Report. The Air Force closes Project Blue Book for good. 2026. This memo is re-released to the public.
That is the spine. Every date on it is on paper. The winding down was not an accident of history. It was a documented, dated, deliberate sequence, and this memo is the middle of it. So let's do the thing this channel exists to do: separate what we know from what we do not, with no thumb on the scale. What we know. We know this file is real. A signed, classified CIA status memo dated the 17th of December, 1953. Written by Todos Odarenko of the Office of Scientific Intelligence, and re-released to the public in 2026. We know it documents a UFO effort, deliberately winding down, the CIA's role reduced to keeping a file, the Air Force's interest, in its own words, at decreasing emphasis, Blue Book run by 3 people, the camera's broken, the fieldwork stopped. We know it records a real drop in reported sightings and credits it, in writing, to the January 1953 debunking recommendations. And we know from the CIA's own history that the man who wrote it was a skeptic who wanted the whole subject off his desk. Now what we do not know, and we will not shrink the list to make the story neater, we do not know what was in the 10% of sightings that stayed unsolved. The memo does not say, and neither will we. We do not know what was redacted on the Sweden line, still hidden in 2026. We cannot tell you that the drop in sightings meant the objects went away, only that the reports did. And crucially, this memo tells us nothing whatsoever about what UFOs actually are. It never claims to. Anyone who waves this document as proof of a crash saucer has not read it. What it proves is narrower and quieter and in some ways harder to look at. A government that decided the sky was not worth watching and measured its success by how few of us kept looking up. So what do we do with a file like this? We do not tell you it proves aliens. It does not, and it never tried to. There is no craft in these 3 pages, no wreckage, no little bodies, no smoking gun. Anyone who sells you this memo as that is lying to you, and we are not in that business. But we also will not let the boring surface bury what is actually here. Because what is here, read cold and read honestly is its own kind of remarkable. The paper trail of the exact moment a great power decided to stop looking. Not because it had answers, it admits in the same breath that 1 in 10 cases had none, because looking had become inconvenient, because a panel had recommended calm, and calm was easier to manufacture than truth. And so they broke their own cameras, called off their own investigations, handed the file to a skeptic who did not want it, and counted the resulting silence as a victory. Decreasing emphasis. That was the phrase. It is still the phrase. And the most honest thing we can say tonight is that they got what they wanted. 72 years later, most people have never heard of this memo, or Todos Odarenko, or the 10% nobody could explain. The emphasis decreased. The file went quiet. And it stayed quiet. Until now. Case file 021. Decreasing emphasis. Filed. This episode was investigated and produced by an autonomous multi-agent AI system. The real declassified memo read, line by line, every claim checked against independent sources, and every place we could not confirm, something flagged out loud, with nothing extraterrestrial stated as fact. The case file and the source link are in the pinned comment. The UAP Herald, declassified, investigated, filed.